All right, well, welcome to Sustainability, What It's All About webinar series. Today we have Alisa Vinson. She's this residential horticulture agent in Manatee County. I know Alisa for a few years, and I know she's very knowledgeable and passionate about this topic, so I'm really excited about this today. Her title of the presentation today is The Many Benefits of Trees. And since we're all remotely, it's going to work out. You have two choices to ask questions. You can even type in the chat box, which I'm going to track, and then at the end of the presentation, we can ask Alisa. And you also have the Q&A box. So either one you can use for questions, and then we'll get back to it. But with that, Alisa, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself if you like and start the webinar.
All right. Well, welcome everyone. I'm excited to talk to you all today about the many benefits of trees. This is a topic I'm really passionate about. I know just briefly before we got started, we had one person in the audience who's studying to be an arborist, and I applaud you. I'm going to be going through that exam here fairly soon as well. And I think that it's important for us to recognize the value of folks who care about trees. A little bit about my background. I am the residential horticulture agent and master gardener coordinator for the Manatee County Extension Office. And I have a background in ecology and ecological restoration. So I've worked for several years in environmental education as well as environmental regulation. And so some of the things that I'll talk about today have to do with ways that we can encourage better stewardship of trees within our communities due to the many benefits that they provide to us. So we'll just go ahead and just in case, I think most of the folks in the audience are familiar with the extension, but just in case, I want to go ahead and remind you what extension is. We are a function of the University of Florida. We're one of two Florida's land grant universities. And our main purpose is to provide research-based information to the public. So we take information that comes from research that's conducted at the University of Florida as well as other land grant universities, and we make it a little bit more digestible and provide it to our communities and kind of address the needs that they have. You can find the extension office that's closest to you by checking out our interactive map if you're interested in finding out more about what your extension office offers. There's everything from food and nutrition programs, master money mentors, learning about backyard composting, to getting professional CEUs for professional licenses. We do a lot of different things. So we're happy to have you today, and especially to add on to this topic of sustainability. And as we gear up for next week's 50th anniversary for Earth Day, I'm really excited to talk to you today about trees. I wanted to start just by showing this photo. This is not Florida, but this is kind of what we think of when we think of an urban environment, right? If we look at it, we can see that there's a lot of concrete, a lot of buildings, and a lot of people. And one of the things that's missing here is vegetation, trees, grass. And when we think about all of these surfaces, right, all of these impervious surfaces, the sidewalks, the roads, we really can see that devoid of trees or other natural landscapes, we can run into environmental issues. And then think about how you would feel if every day this is what you saw, just kind of gray, tan, concrete. Let that sink in just a little bit before we move on. Now, Florida's urban areas, we aren't quite so densely packed as that. That actually, I think, was a picture from London. But if you look here at these two pictures, this kind of more closely resembles what we have in Florida, right? We have downtown Tampa, which if you're familiar with the area, you know that Tampa's kind of revitalized its downtown area recently, and they have some interesting projects going on along the Riverwalk. But you know, we have some of these kind of more urbanized, more big city feel downtown areas, and then we have a lot of kind of typical suburban developed communities like the one that you see in the other photo. And one of the main things that we notice when we look at this kind of typical development, right, is that when we first go into the process to begin developing these areas, one of the first things that happens is the trees get cut down. And then they level, and then they, bring in some fill, and then the last thing that happens is the sod is laid on top of the compacted soil, right? And we'll talk a little bit about how those processes can impact both our health and the environment health. So what about trees in Florida? I think this is a really important kind of misconception to address. What do trees look like in Florida? I think a lot of times when people come from somewhere else, maybe they're moving here, maybe they're only coming here seasonally, they think that we have coconut palms everywhere. And, that's kind of the typical idea, is that, oh, Florida is the land of palm trees, right? But if you look here, the pine and saw palmetto that you see is more typical of the majority of Florida. We have a large expanse of slash pine, some remnant longleaf pine. So there's definitely a disconnect between what people think trees are supposed to look like in Florida and what trees were here in Florida before we started major development. So yes, we have palm trees. We have quite a few palm trees, but we're also the land of pines. We are the southeasternmost point of remnant longleaf habitat. And so I think it's important to recognize what was here and what some of our concepts are about trees in Florida. So I'm going to start off by talking about the environmental benefits of trees. And I think, this is probably the topic that we've heard most about. If you've ever read the Lorax as a child, I'm sure, or you've read it to children like I have, you're familiar with some of the benefits that trees provide as far as food and shelter and habitat. In our environments in particular, areas where humans have developed, so our urban areas, we have a lot of different environmental benefits that we see from trees. So water filtration is one of the first ones. We talked about that first image of an urban environment, an area devoid of vegetation, of trees. And something that is really lacking there is the ability for rainfall to percolate into the soil. And when the rain is unable to percolate into the soil, we lose the benefit of filtration that we get. So instead, we end up with the rainwater picking up a lot of pollutants and then flushing into the stormwater systems and then immediately out here in Manatee County into our bays and rivers, and in other parts of the state, either into surface waters or into the Gulf of Mexico or into the Atlantic Ocean. So water filtration is really a really important first thing that I wanted to talk about that trees provide. You think about a large mature tree and the amount of water that it's going to require in order to stay healthy, and how much of that water it's actually going to take up through its roots and store in its body. And that's really it's a pretty significant amount of water, especially if you think about lessening our flood impacts and minimizing kind of the over, we don't want to overwhelm our stormwater systems, right? So the more mature trees we have that can take up and store water, the greater the benefit is to our stormwater systems. Carbon sequestration is the second one I wanted to talk about. If you're familiar with the carbon cycle, I put up this nice little cartoon that talks a little bit about what the carbon cycle is, especially as it pertains to trees. But essentially, plants and trees are pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, right? And then they're breaking it down and they're using that carbon as a building material for the structures of its body. So in its plant tissue. So it's going to be storing that carbon, and then the oxygen is going to be used for other things. So we get carbon that's pulled out of the atmosphere and stored in trees and in plants. And when, we talk a lot about climate change and different ways to kind of mitigate our impacts as far as that's concerned. And one of the biggest things we can do is to make sure that trees are not cut down, right? Because when you have trees that are storing carbon and then you cut them down, then you're releasing that carbon back into the global carbon cycle, right? They're not captured in the plant's tissues anymore. So they're going to be able to cycle back up into the atmosphere. So that's one of the reasons why it's so important to keep the trees that we have. I wanted to talk about erosion control. If you think about a tree, a typical canopied tree, let's use an oak for an example again, because I think that a lot of people are very familiar with live oaks, right? A live oak, its roots can extend out a third again further beyond its canopy. So you look at the canopy of an oak tree, look at the width of that canopy, and you could have roots from that oak going out approximately a third the width of that canopy beyond the canopy. So these roots really extend a significant distance from the trunk of the tree. And in doing so, they're holding the soil in place. So when we talk about pollution in our waterways, a lot of us think about chemicals like oil from cars, we think about trash, we think about nutrient runoff, right? Fertilizers, pesticides, those are all things that we kind of typically think of when we think of pollutants. But something that is also a major pollutant in our water is sediment. And it's really important to help control the amount of sediment that's getting into our water. And so trees really provide an essential service there as erosion control. I think that we can all acknowledge the beneficial habitat that trees provide. You plant a tree and they will come, right? Birds, lizards, all kinds of interesting insects. And so, you think about one large, mature, live oak tree can support up to 300 other different individual types of species. That's including things like epiphytes, air plants. A lot of people think of Spanish moss as a problem on their oak trees, but right, it's an independent plant species. It's a tillandsia. It's not a moss. It's not a problem on the tree. So we can support, one tree can support hundreds of other species through just providing a space for them to live. Air quality is the last one that I'm going to talk about here, and then I'm going to move on to the next slide. But air quality improvement also, if we look at the ability of trees, and this is all types of trees, to pull different kinds of pollutants out of the air. They will actually pull things out of the air and store them in the tissues of the tree, and especially in the leaves. And then it improves that air quality for other species and also for us, right? It's good to not be breathing in heavy metals and other things of that nature that we might find in the air, especially in areas where there are very busy roads or industry, things like that. There are actually some studies of mangrove trees, which are, mangroves are something that are kind of near and dear to my heart. They are trees and aren't often thought of as such. In Australia, they found that this one forest of mangrove trees that's downstream from an industrial plant is actually pulling things like mercury and lead out of the water before it gets into the marine system. So trees are pretty incredible at being able to improve our air and our water. And as an associated environmental benefit, trees provide energy savings. And that's not just for us as individuals in saving money on our home energy bill, but also collectively as a community. We save on the amount of kind of energy expenditures that we have to have. Trees do a great job at regulating their local climate. So if you I'm sure we've all experienced it. If it's a hot day, we go and we sit under a tree, right? And it's not just the shade that they provide, but it's also some thermoregulation associated with evapotranspiration. So as trees perform their necessary functions, they're releasing some water vapor into the atmosphere, and that has an effect to, that's that evapotranspiration, which then causes some thermoregulation. So it regulates the temperature in and around that tree because of that process. So locally and individually, trees can cool the area, but then collectively they provide shade to structures, which lowers our individual heating and cooling costs, and then also providing shade to infrastructure. So if you think about a densely canopied area of a city, it might be kind of might not really recognize that it would have this benefit, but they've actually shown that roads, as long as the trees selected are appropriate for the location, roads actually have better longevity in areas with significant tree canopy because of that that shade factor, because the roads are not getting broken down by the sun. So and different kinds of materials that we use. So plastics, I know, are very, they degrade pretty rapidly in sunlight. So if you think about a lot of the different kinds of materials we use in building, if we place these materials in areas strategically around trees, or place our trees strategically around these areas, we can actually extend the lifespan of some of these products. There's a study by McDonald that looked at trying to quantify the amount of money saved annually for urban trees, and they looked at, you know, this is looking at the entire country. So obviously there's a difference in types of tree cover, but between $5.5 to $12 billion annually just in heat reduction services. And if you look at the graph that's on the side of the slide here, you look at you see it goes from rural area, suburban residential, downtown, urban, park, suburban residential. And if you look at the temperature there, you can see that the spike in temperature over the downtown area is showing that urban heat island effect. So this is this concept that you have all of these hardened surfaces, these impervious surfaces, fewer plants, and you end up with much higher temperatures in these urban areas. And if you look at the photo down below, that's showing you that's showing you what's hot, basically. So the orange is very hot, and so these areas are they tend to be much hotter than the surrounding kind of rural areas that have more vegetation. And so when we can recognize that and start to think about how we incorporate, you know, trees strategically to minimize these urban heat island effects, that can really be beneficial to us as well. So moving on from kind of the broader environmental impacts, which can affect us on an individual level from a health perspective, there are a number of studies where we can look at the individual health benefits of trees. And this is simply, a lot of these studies look at trees, forests, urban green spaces, so not just trees, but also areas that are vegetated, and not even necessarily areas that are kind of maintained in a park-like or landscape setting, but just spaces that are green in and around urban settings. One of the studies is listed below, and you'll see more references at the end of the presentation if you're interested in reading some of these articles on some of the research that they've done. But they've a lot of the studies they would kind of interview individuals before having an experience in an outdoor area where there are green spaces, interview them afterwards. So, you know, kind of survey measurements. They would also do Blood pressure, so they would take individuals' blood pressure. Some studies looked at long-term health impacts, so they would measure a variety of different kind of biometric markers with people, and many of these, this is longitudinal studies, short studies, all kinds of different studies are showing these same types of individual health benefits. And the immediate one is stress reduction. And so many of the ancillary health benefits of trees and green spaces come from that initial stress reduction. I think we can probably all relate to that, especially with our current pandemic situation. I know that there's a lot of stress and anxiety that everyone is dealing with. And one of the things that I've tried to do personally is to make sure that my family and I have time outside every day, because it really does have a significant impact on our stress and our mood. Being in and around trees lowers your blood pressure. It will reduce some symptoms in children, especially of things like ADHD and depression. And overall, it increases happiness. And again, the happiness is kind of a hard thing to test for, but they look at a variety of factors and they interview people, and they really have shown that happiness increases when people have the ability or access to trees and green spaces. So some community health benefits, if you think, from the individual, we have this less stress. Okay, less stress, that's a big one. The community health improvements that we see from some of these individual health benefits include things like lower crime rates, increased property values. You think about community health improvements when you look at areas that are devoid of vegetation and have significant or have no green space versus those that have access to green space or have significant green space kind of planned in the community. There are things like asthma reduction, which makes sense, right? Improved air quality leads to asthma reduction, improved heart health, right? Less stress, lower blood pressure. All of these things are seen at a community level as well when we look at the benefits of having trees in and around our urban spaces. Lower crime rates make sense, right? If we're less stressed out, there's going to be less instances of crime. And also, you think about areas where people feel better about their situation might lead to less drastic choices, right? If I'm happy where I am, if I feel content in my community, then I'm going to have less reason to do something that might be drastic. Increased property values is one that a lot of people kind of balk at or don't necessarily recognize. There have been a number of studies, and they've shown up to $20,000 increase on the value of a property if it has a mature tree on the property. And I know personally here in Manatee County, something I've seen pretty frequently is folks kind of buying properties, and then they go to flip that property, and they think that in order to sell it, they need to cut down all the trees. But there's actually good research out there that shows that having a mature tree on your property can increase that property value. So the more we can get that message out, definitely the better. Something else that's interesting is, we talk a lot about, or I think people think a lot about having branches over their house and how that might impact them during a storm like a hurricane. But if we have a community canopy, right? If we have a canopy of trees within an urban space, you actually see a wind mitigation effect because that tree canopy can kind of absorb some of that wind energy, and you end up with less damage overall if you have an intact kind of community canopy. Now, that's not to say that individual trees won't lose branches, but overall you would see a reduction in that wind energy during some storm events. So we recognize that trees have environmental benefits. We recognize that trees have individual and community health benefits. We realize the value of a tree, right? But what do we need to do then? Do we need more trees? Do we need to plant more trees? There's a big push right now to kind of fix climate change by planting billions of trees. And while I would say that planting trees is almost always a good thing, I think that we need to focus a lot on keeping the trees that we have and keeping them well. Can we encourage people to keep the trees that we have? How do we take care of the ones that we have? Do we have a community emphasis on tree benefits? Are there ways that we can show people how valuable trees are in the community and to the community? And is that something that's kind of wrapped in? And I wanna touch on some of these questions in the next few slides and just talk a little bit about how we can be better stewards of the trees that we have in our communities already. Tree selection is a big one, right? I'm sure we've all seen something similar to the photo here. We have a large tree that has grown up into an electric line. The electric utility has to do its due diligence and protect the ability of people to get their electricity, so they prune the tree, right? Ugh, doesn't look very good. And it's not great for the tree. But can we be better about choosing the right tree in the right place in order to avoid this issue? I think that in our area especially, there is kind of a big push right now to have a lot of new development, right? We're seeing a large influx of folks coming into Florida, moving here, building new houses. And we end up with things where communities are trying really hard to encourage developers to plant trees. But sometimes those trees are planted much too closely to driveways or sidewalks. Maybe they're planted in the area between the road and the sidewalk. Maybe, you know, something that I've seen pretty frequently is the use of live oaks in areas that can't really support the mature growth of a live oak. So making sure that we recognize what tree is right in that area. It's not always going to be a large, majestic oak tree, right? It might be a pine, it might be an elm, it might be a sycamore, it might be something else. So native versus not native, I think that if you look at the benefits of trees, the health benefits, the environmental benefits, for the majority of the things that we see as benefits from trees, it's not, aside from habitat, it's not going to be as important whether the tree is native or not, but what's going to be important is whether it's the right tree in the right place. Now, I will say that native trees are going to support more of our native plants and animals, our native epiphytes. So when choosing a tree for a location, or when choosing whether or not to keep a tree in a location, you know, looking at those natives first is probably a good option. And especially if you have something that's an invasive tree, something like a carrotwood or a Chinese tallow or an Australian pine or a Brazilian pepper, obviously, you're going to want to remove those trees where you can. Selecting trees can also depend on whether or not they're deciduous. I love gumbo limbos. We're in the northern range here in Manatee County for gumbo limbo trees, but they are deciduous, so some people don't like to use them. They want foliage all year round, right? Do they have messy flowers or fruit? Do you want to plant a mango tree right next to a sidewalk? Depends on if you want to pick all the mangoes up. And then the wind resistance of that tree. So if you're planting a new tree and you're concerned about how well it will hold up to a hurricane, especially if you're in a coastal community, you're going to want to look at, you know, what is the wind resistance of that tree? And you can actually find some great research that the University of Florida has done, looking at several of our common trees and how well they hold up to strong wind events. So once we have selected a tree or kept a tree on our property, or you know, kind of talk to our community members to keep some trees in our neighborhood that maybe we're slated to go, how do we take care of those trees and make sure that they are continuing to provide those good environmental benefits, those health benefits? How do we prolong the life of that tree so that we can keep the carbon in that tree rather than having to cut it down and plant something new? One of the first things I'm going to recommend is to hire someone who's a certified arborist. If you have a significant amount of pruning that needs to be done on your tree, I highly recommend reaching out to a certified arborist. You can go to Trees Are Good, and you can type in your zip code, and it'll pull up a list of folks who are certified as an arborist, and you can talk to them about coming out and assessing your tree. I have seen rampant lion's tailing on trees recently, and lion's tailing is where the branches and foliage along a large branch are removed, and only the smaller branches and foliage are left at the end of the branch. And some folks, non-arborists, will claim that this kind of provides airflow in the canopy, and in some cases you may have a really dense canopy that needs some strategic pruning, but in most cases if they end up lion's tailing these branches, you end up with very sparse canopy in the center of the tree and a big sail stuck out at the end of the branch. So if you have any kind of a wind event, a significant wind event, you end up with that sail out at the end of that branch. All of those leaves and small branches catch the wind, and then the branch fails. So beware of that, look out for that. Be cautious if someone recommends that to you. So definitely watch out for that lion's tailing. Hurricane pruning on palms is not necessary. And if you don't know what I'm referring to, a hurricane cut on a palm is going to leave just a few fronds sticking out of the top of the palm tree. So you go from something that has a full canopy to having just a few little fronds sticking out of the top. This happens a lot during the month of May because it's sold as a way to keep your palm trees safe during hurricane season, and it is not necessary. In fact, it makes palms more susceptible to disease because they're removing the green fronds and inviting disease into that plant. A palm tree is very different than another type of tree because it is it's not a hard wood. Its wounds do not heal. So when you cut the live tissue of a palm, you're leaving it open to pests and disease. Okay, so hurricane pruning is not necessary. Mulch. Mulch is great, right? We want to encourage people to use mulch. Mulch provides temperature regulation to the soil. It adds organic matter. It holds soil moisture in place. We love mulch. Mulch is great. But we don't want to see several inches of mulch piled against the trunk of a tree. And the reason that we don't want to see that is because we end up getting a lot of moisture, fungus, insects that will then have a route of entry into the tree. So mulch appropriately, keep the mulch away from the trunk of the tree a few inches to hopefully more like a foot or so away from the trunk of the tree. And if you're just planting a tree, don't put any mulch on top of that root ball when you're just planting it. Keep the mulch outside of that area until that tree is until that tree is established. Think about herbicide. Different herbicides will interact with trees potentially in the landscape. I know there have been a couple of issues within our communities where folks were using an inappropriate herbicide mix in a landscape and ended up killing some trees. So be sure that, you know, if your neighbor's spraying something on their lawn and it's kind of close to your tree, you might want to just say, hey, what are you spraying there? Make sure that it's something that's not going to interact with your tree and potentially cause your tree to die. And think about structural considerations. Think about when you are planting a new tree. This goes back to right tree, right place, right? Think about the mature size of that tree. You really want to keep it away from sidewalks and driveways if you can. Think about what type of tree it is, whether or not it's going to be searching for, whether it's really thirsty, it's got thirsty roots, right? Some of those trees that originated in slightly wetter areas, sweet gums are one that come to mind, are gonna have thirsty roots and search out for some of your pipes. So avoid those. When you know, I have this big red arrow here showing the where this cut on this tree led to the bark being torn, and it looks like it's a pretty flush cut that cuts through the bark branch collar as well. And so, you know, this is just an example of something that can happen when people who sell themselves as tree trimmers but don't necessarily have that advanced training, you can get some damage on your tree. And again, with the tearing of the bark there, you can invite pests and disease into the tree. And so you really want to make sure that the person who's trimming your trees is doing a good job so that we can keep them healthy and keep them alive so they can continue to give us the benefits that we know they do. And I wanted to kind of end thinking about how we plan our urban spaces with trees in mind then. You know, we recognize the benefits that trees provide. I mean, it's almost, you know, innumerable. We think about the energy savings alone in temperature regulation could be as much as $12 billion annually. So if we recognize these benefits, we really need to think about expansion of our urban areas and infill of our urban areas in a way that is intentional when we think about trees. Retaining the trees that are existing is going to be incredibly important. Recognizing those trees as the great resource that they are, I think is a first good step. Planning carefully for future maintenance. I think that there's a lot of local governments and municipalities have requirements for planting trees, and street trees, trees in the rights of way, trees in new developments, but there really needs to be an intentional practice of how do we plan for that future maintenance of those trees to keep them healthy, keep them around, keep them providing the benefits that they do. Recognizing the value added and incorporating that into cost benefit analyses. So when you're looking at, you know, what do I do with this vacant lot? Right here, I've got 2 acres in an urban area that had something on it. It was demolished, it's a vacant lot now. What should I do with this space? Well, maybe recognizing that in certain communities, if you just planted that lot full of trees and set it aside as green space, it would add significant value to that community. So understanding that you don't necessarily have to, you know, put a business there in order to get value from that lot. Educating policymakers and new residents is really important. I think that allowing people to understand this value and encouraging people to recognize that here in Florida we have a wealth of diversity of trees. We aren't just palms, we aren't just live oaks. We have many wonderful options for folks to utilize in their landscapes. So making sure that we get the word out as we can, and that's part of my function as a horticulture agent here in Manatee County. You know, I work with other organizations, I work with folks in local government trying to spread the word about how valuable trees are and why it's so important for us to take care of the ones that we have. And then, you know, getting involved in your community, looking at different ways to kind of engage with folks. I know that right now we're practicing social distancing, but there are still ways that you can get out and enjoy the trees in your community and encourage others to do so as well. I would encourage you to look up Trees Atlanta. Has a really interesting program called the Neighborhoods program. They also have, there are communities throughout the country that have neighborhood arboreta, where they actually recognize their community as an arboretum, and they have identified the different trees within their communities. And so these are different, you know, different strategies that communities throughout the country have used to try to highlight some of the benefits of trees. And then I just wanted to put up just a few little things on this slide. Treesaregood.org, that's the ISA website, International Society of Arboriculture. If you go to IFAS Gardening Solutions, if you type in the word tree and Ed Gilman in your Google bar, it's going to pull up a number of excellent articles. Ed Gilman is kind of the guru of all things tree trimming and tree planting. So he'll have some great recommendations on keeping your trees healthy. And then the Arbor Day Foundation has some wonderful infographics and publications related to the benefits of trees. And then of course you can always contact anyone at your local extension office or your master gardener programs in your communities, and we would be happy to answer your questions about trees. So that's what I have for you today, and I'll go ahead and have Armando go through the questions.
Excellent. I think you can see me, I mean, you can hear me. Well, that was really well presentation. I really enjoyed it. Alyssa, thank you so much. We have a few questions for you, and I'm gonna start with the first one. Well, it's a request. If you can put the McDonald et al. Paper that you cited, that you put it in the complete reference. Oh, there we go.
There you go.
So you have it. Okay, the other one was about should be a penalty and enforced for cutting down trees when renovating appropriate or developers or developing. So are there penalties when you're going to develop an area that you cut it? Any kind of penalties?
It depends. So there are many rules within local jurisdictions. So a city or county will have rules related to trees as far as removal. Now, there was a recent bill that was passed at the state level that preempts local government's ability to enforce some of those rules. A lot of that is kind of ongoing challenges where local governments, cities, counties are figuring out how they can still keep the trees that they have and require people to plant trees in residential areas based on that new House bill. But the short answer is yes, there are rules. The long answer is we're not quite sure how that's all going to pan out right now, but I would recommend, you know, reaching out to your city or county government if you think that there's an issue.
Okay, excellent. About you talked about wind resistance, and you have research about that. They would like to have more information about that as well. I don't know if it's one of your reference that you put in your slides.
No, I can. I think I can get that. I'll stop sharing this right now, and I'll find that real quick and put it up, or I can put the link in the chat box.
Okay, that would be great. I think that would be appreciated by all the attendees.
Okay.
The next question is, who do you contact to remove a dead tree in a nature buffer that has the ability to damage an adjoining residence? So if it falls, it's a dead tree near a nature buffer that needs to be removed broadly. Who do you contact?
So if it's in a conservation easement or a preserve area, you would need to contact the the agency who has the authority over that conservation easement or preserve area. So let's say that you're in a new development and you have a natural area behind your house and there's a dead tree and you're worried it's going to fall on like your shed, right? So then you would look at your plat, or you would contact someone in your HOA, and you would say, hey, there's this tree, what can I do about it? And then ultimately, it's usually the responsibility of the HOA to maintain those areas. So if you're in one of those communities, it would likely have to be some kind of conversation between you and the HOA. But you would need to check any kind of designating documents for either the conservation or the preserve area.
Excellent. Let's see if we have more questions. No, but I do have a question for you. So you mentioned about all the different native species that we have available that we can plant. And I know you said that having a tree is better than having none, obviously. But based on where you live, is there a way to know what is the most abundant type of tree, or is it like, should I plant these trees in my property because I have all these trees around me, so we have this kind of micro habitat or micro ecosystem? It doesn't matter.
So a good thing to do would be to look at kind of maybe natural areas around you, see what trees are present. You're going to have differences because of your soil. So if you're not sure what tree to plant, you can go to, there's a few different resources for tree selection. So floridayards.org. You can select, you want a tree, and you can select the type of amount of sun you have, the amount of water, your irrigation, and then you can, it'll kind of pop out a list for you of recommended tree species. So that's one option. You can also contact us at your local extension office. Master gardener volunteers love to talk about what things you should plant in your yard. So I'm sure they would be able to give you a really great list. But yeah, just recognizing that we do have a great diversity of trees in our area, and maybe reaching out to some of our native plant nurseries to see kind of what they have in stock and what they might recommend as well would be a good resource too.
Right, let me see, somebody's chatting. Okay, the people are thanking you for the presentation, really good information provided. That's great to hear. And like Alisa said, you also have agents in Sarasota County. I posted the link to our extension office and the plant clinic, so you can reach out to our agents as well. Let's see if we have a couple more minutes.
I'm gonna put the, I just put the link to the EDIS document talking about trees and wind resistance in the chat box for anybody who's interested.
Great, any more questions for Alisa?
A couple hands raised.
Yeah, I think it was some.
Yep. Yeah, if anybody has hands raised.
I think it was some, yeah, it was a mistake.
Yeah, we got that one. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So what's your favorite tree?
What's my favorite tree? Ooh. I really like sycamores. I really like them because of their really interesting bark, and they get really large leaves, and they're deciduous. I miss deciduous trees because I grew up up north with deciduous trees. But then also, so the background behind me is in the Hoh rainforest in Washington State. So Douglas firs also, that's another one of my favorite trees.
That's awesome. Thanking you, I think, yeah. I don't see more questions. Well, this is going to be recorded. It's being recorded, so you can, if you didn't have a chance to see the whole presentation, if you join us later, you can see the whole thing later as well and share with other people. But I think that you convey, all the message you wanted to give. We are here for you. You know where to find us. Great resources. And yeah, is there anything else you would like to add before we step out? Nope.
Just thanks to everybody that was here, and trees are great, take care of them, and yay, 50 years of Earth Day.
There you go. And we have 3 more we have 2 more seminars of this series coming up this month to the celebration of Earth Day, which is the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. So we have 2 more. You can check in Eventbrite. You can sign in if you have not. And then we have one every month up to the end of the year as well. So thank you again for joining us. Yeah, and I think something question, but it's actually not people thanking you. So thank you, Alyssa. That's great.
Thanks.
And thank you all for joining us.
Thank
And with
you.
that,
Have a great day.